The surgical lamps hummed above me, casting a harsh, unforgiving light on the carnage of the trauma bay. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing, 10 hours into a double shift, and the world had narrowed down to the rhythmic, failing beep of a heart monitor. "He's hemorrhaging," the surgeon barked. "Where is that O negative?" The silence that followed was deafening. The blood bank was empty. I looked down at the man on the table. Even through the gore and the oxygen mask, he looked like a king in exile, all sharp jawline and intricate, dark tattoos that crawled up his neck like shadows. Without a word, I bypassed the locking mechanism on the supply cart. I knew the protocol. I knew this was professional suicide. But as I slid the needle into my own arm and connected the line to his, I didn't care. As the first pulse of my blood entered his system, his hand, heavy with ink and cold as ice, clamped onto my wrist. His eyes snapped open, a piercing, predatory blue that seemed to look right through my scrubs and into my soul. I felt a jolt of electricity, a psychic shiver that told me. The rhythmic hiss of the ventilator had finally stopped, replaced by the shallow, jagged breathing of a man fighting his way back to the surface. I sat at the edge of the guest chair, my own arm throbbing where the needle had been, feeling a strange, hollow lightness in my chest. I had stayed long after my shift ended, hovering in the shadow of the private recovery suite, unable to look away from the man who now carried a quart of my soul in his veins. His hand moved first, the one covered in dark, serpentine ink that coiled around his knuckles. It searched the bedside rail until it found my wrist, his grip snapping shut like a trap. I gasped, but I didn't pull away. I couldn't. Marco's eyes flickered open, bloodshot and burning with a terrifying, lucid intensity. He didn't look confused or disoriented by the anesthesia. He looked like a man who had just discovered a hidden treasure and was already calculating how to bury it where no one else could find it. "You," he rasped, the sound like grinding stones. "I'm your nurse, Marco." "You're in recovery," I said, my voice trembling despite my years of training. "You lost a lot of blood. You shouldn't be moving." A slow, predatory smirk ghosted across his pale lips. He pulled my hand closer to his chest, forcing me to lean over him until I could smell the faint scent of antiseptic and something deeper, something masculine and dangerous. "I felt it," he whispered, his blue eyes boring into mine. "While the world was going black, I felt you pouring yourself into me. Cold logic says it was a transfusion. But my heart knows it was a surrender. It was medical necessity, nothing more," I countered, though the heat rising in my cheeks betrayed me. "I broke protocol to save a life. I would have done it for anyone. Lie to the doctors, Olivia. Don't lie to me." He squeezed my wrist, his thumb tracing the vein he had seen me puncture. "There is a tether between us now. Every beat of my heart is an echo of yours. You've bound yourself to a man who doesn't believe in coincidences, only in deaths." I felt the air leave the room. This wasn't the gratitude of a patient, it was the claim of a conqueror. "I don't want your money, Marco. I just want to go back to my life," I said, finally wrenching my arm free. He let me go, but only because he knew the walls were already closing in. He gestured weakly toward the bedside table, where my cracked smartphone had been replaced by a sleek, titanium device, and a set of keys to a car I could never afford sat atop a thick envelope of cash. "Your old life ended the moment our blood mingled," he said, his voice regaining its lethal velvet edge. "You saved a king, Olivia. Now, you'll learn what it means to be kept by one. You aren't just a nurse anymore. You're mine." The hospital didn't feel like a sanctuary anymore. It felt like a stage where the scenery had been shifted overnight. When I arrived for my morning shift, the familiar, chaotic energy of the surgical wing had been replaced by a heavy, watchful silence. Two men in charcoal suits stood like stone pillars outside the break room, their earpieces glinting under the fluorescent lights. They didn't look at me, but I felt their focus shift as I passed, a physical weight pressing against my back. "Olivia," a word, Dr. Eris said, intercepting me before I could reach the nurse's station. He looked pale, his usual confidence replaced by a twitchy, forced smile. We've had a significant private donation. A benefactor who insists on absolute discretion and the best possible care for our high-profile recovery in Suite 901. 901? I blinked. That's the VIP penthouse. We don't even have the staffing for. You've been reassigned, he cut in, handing me a new security badge. It was gold-flecked, a stark contrast to my standard blue plastic. Full-time. No other patients, no rotations. Just him. It was a specific condition of the grant. The grant was Marco. I knew it before I even stepped into the elevator. He wasn't just recovering, he was colonizing. When the doors opened on the 9th floor, the smell of antiseptic was buried under the scent of expensive tobacco and lilies. The entire floor had been cleared of other patients. It was a ghost ward, haunted by men in dark suits who stepped aside for me with a terrifying, synchronized deference. I pushed open the heavy oak doors to a suite. Marco was no longer hooked to the monitors. He was sitting up in a velvet armchair that certainly hadn't belonged to the hospital yesterday, a silk robe draped over his broad, tattooed shoulders. He was reading a file, but he closed it the moment I entered, his gaze locking onto mine with the same predatory heat that had burned through my dreams. You look tired, Olivia, he said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to hum in the very floorboards. The commute from that cramped apartment is too long. I've had my people look into closer arrangements. You can't do this, Marco, I said, my voice rising as I marched toward him. You can't buy a hospital. You can't buy my career. I didn't buy the hospital. I simply ensured its excellence, he replied, standing up with a fluid, lethal grace that defied his recent trauma. He moved into my personal space, the sheer heat of his body making my breath hitch. He reached out, his fingers trailing lightly over the new badge pinned to my chest. As for your career, I am merely protecting my investment. My blood is in your veins, and yours is in mine. Why would I let you waste your light on people who don't understand your worth? He leaned in, his lips hovering just inches from my ear. In this wing, you are the only authority. Except for me. Here, you aren't a servant to a system of rules. You are a queen in a kingdom I built just to keep you close. The terrifying part wasn't his arrogance. It was the way my heart hammered against my ribs, not in fear, but in a sudden, traitorous thrill. The sanctuary of the 9th floor was shattered 3 days later by the sound of a voice that didn't belong to Marco's world. Head Nurse Miller, a woman who had spent 30 years wielding hospital policy like a jagged blade, marched into the VIP suite. She didn't look at the suited guards, she looked at me, her eyes narrow and full of professional disdain. I've reviewed the logs, Olivia, she snapped, tossing a printed report onto the mahogany side table. The night of the shooting. There's a discrepancy in the blood units. No requisition form, no signature, and yet the patient survived a massive hemorrhage. You want to tell me how that happened before I hand this to the board and the police? My stomach dropped into a cold abyss. The protocol I had so carefully lived by was finally catching up to me. I looked at Miller, then at Marco, who remained seated, calmly sipping an espresso as if we were discussing the weather. It was an emergency, Mrs. Miller, I began, my voice small. The supply was delayed, and You played God, she finished, her voice rising. You broke federal law, and you're going to lose your license for it. I've already drafted the incident report. You're finished here. I felt the walls of the life I had built beginning to crumble. Everything I had worked for, my stability, my identity, was about to be erased by a single sheet of paper. I looked at Marco, expecting a sneer or a dismissive comment. Instead, I saw a terrifying stillness. He didn't move, but the air in the room seemed to sharpen. Mrs. Miller, Marco said softly. He didn't raise his voice, yet the head nurse froze. He stood up, the silk of his robe whispering against the floor. You are a woman who values order. I respect that. But you are also a woman who is remarkably close to retirement. It would be a tragedy if your pension was liquidated due to unforeseen administrative errors in your own past. Are you threatening me? Miller gasped, though the bravado was leaking out of her. I am offering you a peaceful exit, Marco replied, stepping into the light. He looked like a wolf in a tailored cage. Olivia saved my life. In my world, that makes her sacred. To touch her career is to touch me. Go home, Mrs. Miller. Tell the board you've decided to retire early. My lawyers will ensure the paperwork is generous. Miller looked at me, then at the shadow of the men standing at the door, and finally back at Marco. She didn't say another word. She turned and fled, the report forgotten on the table. I stared at the door long after she was gone, the silence of the room ringing in my ears. Marco walked over and picked up the report, tearing it slowly into tiny white flakes. She's gone, Olivia. The threat is handled, he said, reaching out to tilt my chin up so I had to face him. You destroyed her, I whispered, a tear finally escaping. I lived my life by those rules, Marco. And you erased them. What am I if I'm not a nurse who follows the law? You are mine, he murmured, his thumb catching the tear. The law is for people who need protection from the world. I am the world, Olivia. And you are the only part of it I intend to keep pure. The black silk of the gown felt like liquid shadow against my skin, a stark contrast to the stiff, sterile cotton of the scrubs I had lived in for years. As I stood before the mirror in the penthouse Marco had arranged for me, I barely recognized the woman staring back. The girl who followed every protocol was gone, replaced by a creature of opulence and high-tension nerves. Around my neck hung the weight of his latest claim, a necklace of rubies so deep and vivid they looked like drops of fresh blood crystallized against my throat. They match, Marco's voice rumbled from the doorway. I didn't need to turn to see him. His presence always preceded him like a storm front. He walked toward me, his tuxedo fitting his broad frame with lethal precision. He reached out, his tattooed hand stark against the pale skin of my shoulder, and adjusted the center stone. A reminder of what flows between us. My life, held in your grace. It feels like a brand, I whispered, meeting his gaze in the reflection. It is a shield, he corrected, his eyes dark with a possessive heat. Tonight, the world sees who you are to me. They will learn that to breathe a word against you is to invite the end of their days. The Gala was a blur of gold leaf, champagne, and eyes that felt like daggers. I moved through the crowd on Marco's arm, feeling the way the room parted for him, not out of respect, but out of a primal, shivering fear. He introduced me to men with cold smiles and women with hollow eyes, always keeping his hand firmly on the small of my back, a constant reminder of who I belonged to. The shift happened near the balcony. A man with a jagged scar across his temple, Ivanov, stepped into our path, his smile not reaching his eyes. So, this is the little healer, he sneered, his gaze raking over me with a calculated disrespect that made my skin crawl. I heard you traded your soul for a few gems, nurse. Is the blood of a Volkov really that sweet, or did he just buy your silence? The air around us turned to ice. I felt Marco's posture change, the subtle, terrifying shift of a predator deciding where to strike. Before I could breathe, Marco's hand was at the man's throat, pinning him against a marble pillar with a sickening thud. The sound of glass shattering echoed through the ballroom as guests scrambled back. Her name is Olivia, Marco hissed, his voice a low, guttural promise of death. He leaned in close to Ivanov, the rubies on my neck catching the light like warning flares. And if you ever look at her again without my permission, I will pull the life from your body with my bare hands. She saved me, which means I live only to ensure she is never touched by filth like you. He let the man drop, gasping and clutching his neck. Marco didn't look back. He turned to me, his expression softening into something devastatingly tender, even as his knuckles remained white with rage. Are you all right, Mia Cara? I looked at the terrified crowd, then at the man who had just offered a life for my honor. The line between safety and danger had vanished. I wasn't just his nurse or his guest. I was his heart, and in his world, that was the most dangerous place to be. The violent display at the Gala haunted me, The image of Marco's hands, the same hands that had touched me with such tenderness, clamped around a man's throat. I realized then that I wasn't living a fairy tale, I was living in the wake of a hurricane. The rubies felt heavier than ever, a collar of blood-red stones that marked me as the property of a man who ruled by fear. Panic finally overrode the strange, magnetic pull he had on me. I waited until the early hours of the morning, when the penthouse was silent and the shadows were long. I shed the silk gown for a nondescript hoodie and jeans, packing nothing but my old nurse's watch and the meager cash I had hidden away before Marco had replaced my bank account with his millions. I slipped out the service entrance, my heart hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a rhythm that felt like a betrayal of the blood bond he claimed we shared. The city was a blur as I hailed a yellow cab, my eyes darting to every black SUV that passed. I reached JFK Airport just as the sun began to bleed over the horizon. I didn't care where the flight went, as long as it was far from the velvet cage and the scent of lilies. I reached the security gate, my boarding pass trembling in my hand, feeling a flicker of hope. Maybe I could be invisible again. Maybe I could go back to being just Olivia, the nurse who followed the rules. The flight to Seattle is boarding, Olivia. But I don't think you'll be on it. The voice was low, melodic, and devastatingly familiar. I froze. Marco was leaning against a structural pillar, looking entirely out of place in the sterile, plastic environment of the terminal, yet he commanded it nonetheless. He wasn't surrounded by guards. He was alone, his hands shoved into the pockets of his overcoat, his blue eyes fixed on me with a look that wasn't anger. It was profound, quiet certainty. "How did you find me?" I whispered, the boarding pass slipping from my fingers. "I told you, Olivia." "I feel you," he said, stepping toward me. The crowd seemed to melt away, leaving us in a vacuum of his making. You could fly to the other side of the world, and I would still feel the pulse of my life inside your chest. You were trying to run from yourself, not just from me. "I can't live like this, Marco," I sobbed, the adrenaline finally breaking into exhaustion. "The violence, the way you looked at that man. I'm a healer. I don't belong in your world." He stopped just inches away, but he didn't reach for me. He simply stood there, an immovable force. "You save me because you are a healer. And I protect you because I am a predator. It is the balance of us." He leaned down, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "Go. Step through that gate. But know this, if you leave, the part of me that is you will die. And the man who is left behind will burn the world down to find what he lost." I looked at the gate, then back at the man who had turned my blood into his own. The choice wasn't about a flight or a destination. It was about the tether I had created the moment I bypassed protocol. I didn't move toward the plane. I moved toward him, surrendering not to his power, but to the connection I could no longer deny. Returning to the penthouse was not a return to safety, but a descent into a much deeper, quieter kind of tension. While the city bustled below, the atmosphere inside the suite had grown toxic with unspoken secrets. Marco was often locked in his study, the low rumble of voices rising behind the heavy oak doors, while I wandered the halls, a ghost in silk. My medical intuition, sharpened by years of monitoring subtle shifts in patients, told me that the air was changing. The loyalty that usually felt like a physical wall around Marco was beginning to fray at the edges. It happened late one Tuesday while I was looking for a fresh bandage kit in the secondary storage room near the kitchen. I heard muffled voices from the service hallway. Antonio, Marco's longest-serving lieutenant, was speaking in a tone I had never heard him use. It wasn't the voice of a subordinate, it was the voice of an architect. "The shipment in Marseille was the bait," Antonio whispered, his words sharp as a scalpel. "Once we move him to the estate in the Alps, the perimeter will be ours. Volkov is distracted by the girl. He's soft. He's bleeding out through her, and he doesn't even know it." My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, rhythmic warning. Antonio, the man Marco called a brother, was the one holding the knife. I backed away, my sneakers silent on the plush carpet, but the weight of the secret felt like lead in my lungs. I had to tell Marco. I had to warn the man who claimed our blood was one. I found him in the library, staring out at the Manhattan skyline, a glass of amber liquid untouched in his hand. He looked weary, the shadows under his eyes deeper than they had been even in the hospital. "Marco," I said, my voice barely a breath. "We need to talk. About Antonio." He didn't turn around. "Antonio has been with me since we were boys in Moscow, Olivia. He is my right hand." "Your right hand is reaching for your throat," I countered, moving to stand in front of him. I told him what I'd heard, the words tumbling out in a rush of fear. I expected the wolf to wake, for the predatory rage I'd seen at the Gala to return. Instead, Marco just looked at me with a devastating, tired smile. "You see ghosts because you aren't used to this world, mia cara," he said, reaching out to tuck a strand of hair behind my ear. "Loyalty is the only currency we have. Without it, we are nothing. Antonio is loyal." "He said you're soft because of me," I whispered, leaning into his touch despite my terror. "He thinks I'm your weakness." Marco's gaze darkened, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with an intensity that made me shiver. "He's wrong. You aren't my weakness, Olivia. You are the only reason I still care if the heart you gave me keeps beating." He wouldn't listen. The bond of brotherhood was a protocol he refused to break, even as I felt the shadow of the betrayal lengthening over us both. The trap was set, and we were walking straight into the dark. The private estate was a fortress of glass and cold stone perched on a jagged cliffside, designed for isolation but now feeling like a tomb. The silence of the Alpine air was deceptive, a fragile veil that tore apart the moment the first explosion rocked the foundation. I was in the library when the world shattered. The heavy oak doors I had once feared were blown inward, and the air filled with the sharp, metallic tang of cordite and the screams of the dying. "Olivia, get down!" Marco's voice roared over the chaos. He didn't look like the man who had been weary in Manhattan. He was a god of wrath, moving with a terrifying, fluid lethality as he returned fire. He reached me in 3 blurred strides, shielding my body with his own as glass rained down like diamonds. Across the courtyard, I saw him, Antonio. He wasn't hiding. He stood behind a line of tactical shooters, his face a mask of cold ambition. The betrayal I had sensed was no longer a shadow, it was a bloodbath. Marco's loyalists were falling, caught in a crossfire that turned the pristine snow outside into a sea of crimson. "Go to the cellar. Take the tunnel." Marco shoved a heavy handgun into my shaking hands, his eyes locked on mine with a desperate, burning intensity. "I will hold them here. I'm not leaving you." I screamed, but the words were drowned out by a fresh volley of gunfire. Marco turned to face the breach, but Antonio had anticipated the move. A red laser dot danced across Marco's chest, and before I could even draw breath to warn him, a high-caliber round tore through the air. Marco jerked back, the force of the impact spinning him around. He slumped against the stone fireplace, his hand clutching his side as dark, familiar blood began to soak through his white linen shirt. The world went silent for a heartbeat. The shooters began to advance, their boots crunching on the broken glass. In that moment, the nurse who followed protocol died. Something ancient and fierce rose up in my chest, a predatory instinct born of the blood we shared. I didn't run for the tunnel. I grabbed a heavy medical kit from the side table and dragged Marco's heavy frame toward the reinforced panic room behind the library shelves. "You aren't dying today, Marco," I hissed, the adrenaline turning my vision into a sharp, narrow tunnel. "I gave you my life once. I'm not letting you give it back." As the heavy steel door hissed shut and the locks engaged, I looked at the man who had claimed me. He was gray, his breathing shallow, the life I had donated leaking out of him onto the cold floor. Outside, the muffled sound of Antonio's men hammering on the steel echoed like a death knell. I was trapped in a box with a dying king, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I was ready to fight. The panic room was a tomb of cold steel and flickering emergency lights, smelling of ozone and the copper tang of Marco's life pooling on the floor. Outside, the rhythmic, metallic thud of Antonio's men battering the door sounded like a ticking clock, counting down the seconds of Marco's life. I didn't have a sterile or a team of surgeons. I had a tactical medical kit and the desperate, pulsing connection in my veins. Marco's eyes were rolled back, his skin the color of ash, as he fought for every ragged breath. "Stay with me, Marco," I commanded, my voice stripping away the last of my nurse's gentleness. "That's an order." I ripped open his shirt, the linen stiff with blood. The exit wound was messy, and he was sliding into stage 4 shock. My hands, which used to tremble at a broken protocol, were now steady with a terrifying, cold resolve. I didn't have time for a cross-match or a blood bank. I pulled the transfusion line from the kit, my movements a blur of clinical precision born of war. I didn't hesitate as I drove the needle into my own antecubital vein, feeling the sharp, familiar sting. I connected the other end to the port I had just slammed into his arm. As the dark, viscous heat of my blood began to flow through the clear plastic tube, the hammering on the door grew more violent. A thermal charge hissed against the steel, the room heating up like an oven. I ignored it. I was hunched over him, one hand keeping pressure on his shattered side, the other gripped in his cold, ink-stained fingers. "Wake up," I hissed, leaning close to his ear as my own head began to swim from the rapid loss of blood. "You told me I was a queen in your kingdom. A queen doesn't rule alone. Fight for it." A shudder racked his frame. The monitors in the room screamed a low battery warning, but then, his hand, the one that had marked me at the hospital, clamped onto mine with a sudden, bruising strength. His blue eyes snapped open, reflecting the red emergency flares. They weren't the eyes of a dying man. They were the eyes of a monster who had just tasted the soul of the only thing he loved. The steel door groaned, the hinges finally beginning to give way. I reached for the handgun he had given me, the metal cold against my palm, while the tube still connected our bodies. I was the healer and the huntress, his life support and his last line of defense. "They're coming," I whispered, my vision blurring at the edges as our blood mingled in the half-light. Marco's grip on my hand tightened, pulling me flush against his chest even as he reached for his own weapon. A lethal, terrifying smile touched his bloodied lips. "Let them," he rasped, his voice a low vibration of pure, recycled malice. "They forgot one thing, Olivia. They're trying to kill a man who is already made of you." As the door finally buckled inward, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a part of the storm. The smoke from the thermal charge cleared to reveal a world of wreckage, but as Antonio stepped through the threshold, he didn't find a corpse. He found a resurrection. Marco stood in the center of the ruined panic room, his tall frame bolstered by the very blood I was still pouring into him. I stood at his shoulder, the transfusion line a literal umbilical cord of silver and red connecting us, my fingers steady on the trigger of the handgun. The look on Antonio's face wasn't just fear, it was the realization that he had tried to kill a man who had become something more than human. The skirmish was short and brutal. Marco moved with a terrifying, cold efficiency, his movements fueled by the adrenaline and life force I had gifted him twice over. When the last of the traitors fell, the silence that settled over the Alpine estate was no longer heavy with dread, it was a clean slate. Marco turned to me, his face smeared with soot and blood, and gently disconnected the line from my arm. He didn't say thank you, he simply pressed his forehead against mine, our heartbeats finally sinking into a single, steady rhythm. 6 months later, the air was crisp and sweet with the scent of pine and glacier water. We had traded the claustrophobic neon of Manhattan for the endless white peaks of the Swiss Alps. The estate was no longer a fortress under siege, it was a sanctuary. I had replaced my hospital badge with a ring of heavy platinum, but my true title was written in the files of the state-of-the-art medical facility built into the mountainside. I was no longer a nurse following a protocol. I was the architect of an underground medical network that treated the people the world chose to ignore, all under the shadow of Marco's protection. Marco found me on the terrace as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting the snow in shades of violet and gold. He wrapped his arms around me, his hands resting protectively over the slight swell of my stomach. The new blood bond was growing, a life created from the two of us, a bridge between my world of healing and his world of power. "You're thinking about the hospital," he murmured, his voice a low, warm vibration against my neck. "I'm thinking about how small that life was," I replied, leaning back into him. "I used to think the rules kept me safe. I didn't realize they were just keeping me from living." He turned me in his arms, his blue eyes reflecting the vastness of the mountains we now ruled. "You saved a king, Olivia. And in return, you became the only law I will ever follow." In the silence of the Alps, I finally understood. I hadn't lost my soul to a monster. I had found my power in the heart of one. We weren't just survivors anymore. We were a dynasty.